Welcome back, America. I'm Hugh Hewitt, joined by Noah Rothman, senior writer for National Review. Noah, I understand you're sweltering in New Jersey. You're in a heat dome. Is that correct?
I'm deep in the heat dome. Yeah, it's pretty brutal, and it's only going to get worse. Although here we're going to have Southern California temperatures by the end of the week, so I just got to struggle through this.
Yeah, as I said out there, we in Ohio we just call this August, but you folks in New Jersey, you want to make a thing about it, go to the shore. Noah, I want to talk to you about two things: tariffs and Gaza. We might not get to Gaza, but I'm going to start with tariffs. I listened to the editor's podcast while preparing for today's show. I shared Charles's worry that President Trump has usurped congressional authority when it comes to tariffs, and I wonder whether or not the First Circuit will strike it down. And I share your Chicago school disdain for most tariffs as being distortive of the market. However, I'm a pragmatist. And do you know how much money the tariffs brought in June?
Oh, I remember coming across this figure. It was in the hundred billions, 200 billion, something like
It's
that.
100 billion thus far this year,
Yeah.
27 billion in June, and it's beginning to ramp up. Now, my
Yeah, I'm not
alternative way of
celebrating that, Hugh,
thinking,
because it comes out of my pocket.
well,
We pay
but
that.
I'm
It's a
saying,
tax increase that Republicans passed, and I don't
and,
like that.
and we just got a tax cut. I'm very happy. My number one issue is always national security, and the number one bad guy is China, and the number one thing that international trade is not zero trade barriers, but shipping, logistics, the free seas. And the people who defend the free seas is us, primarily. I mean, Singapore has some submarines, and Great Britain's got an aircraft carrier, and Australia's got some submarine. But we protect freedom of navigation, right? Is it possible to think about tariffs, especially in the EU context, as the NATO expenditure they're not been paying for year after year after year, and that they finally are going to pay?
Well, those are two separate issues, are they not? The redevelopment of the defense industrial base and what Republicans have long wanted to see from Europe, which was a stronger ally that would take a more proactive role in its own defense, but in defense of the interests that we establish, that we dictate, and that they steward. I mean, that's what we should want. So, engineering a schism of relations in order to incentivize more military spending on the part of Europe seems to be cutting off our nose to spite our face. But that's a separate issue
No,
from these tariffs. These tariffs have more to do with
I don't.
consumer products.
I know. I view it as a way to get money out of Europe that they should be, because there is in this tariff deal yesterday massive weapons purchases. And globally, there's $27 billion last month that we don't have to spend that's going to go into deficit reduction. And I know you say that consumers pay it, and I agree, classical economists would say that. But we also have good substitution, so I don't necessarily have to pay it if I don't want a European car.
So I would push back on that by noting that the deal that we inked with the EU, to the extent that we know its terms, a lot of this is opaque. But there are
Correct.
strategic exemptions in that deal, and we have a functionally now a free trade relationship with Europe for our strategic exemptions, with the exception of steel, which is somehow not considered a strategic resource by this administration and is subject to a 50% tariff. I don't think that makes a whole lot of sense. But if we are operating under the assumption that free markets cannot meet the demands of a deteriorating international threat environment, then why are we creating free trade zones for strategic resources that are designed to meet that threat? We have a piece
Uh,
in the September issue of National Review by Arthur Herman that indicates the degree to which America's private industries have in the past and should in this moment meet the demands of our security establishment, because our defense contractors are simply not going to be up to the nature of the job. I've said that a lot, but Arthur Herman has articulated it in ways that are very accessible, and I recommend everybody reaches out to it. But we're talking about the
and
private
Arthur
market
wrote the
meeting
book. He,
an
he
international
literally
threat.
wrote the book on how we became the arsenal of democracy. So I will read Arthur about that because he's an expert on that. But just play with my intellectual framework for a moment. We're getting a lot of money that we otherwise wouldn't get from Europe, and around the world, and we're paying for the world's freedom of navigation. So if in fact they're one-sided deals, and Europe sure is screaming a lot about how
Mhm.
one-sided this deal is, ought we not to consider this to be their long overdue contribution to defending the world's free trade order?
I will make a concession on that front. Insofar as this deal involves my colleague Andrew Stuttaford, as you heard, is skeptical of the degree to which these commitments can actually materialize and be met. But nevertheless, it's welcome to see Europe commit to the purchasing of U.S. energy exports and the investment in the U.S. energy industry that it would subsequently patronize. That will put increased pressure on Russia, which still continues to export energy exports to the continent and enjoy the revenues from that. So there's a lot to be said for that aspect of the deal. But by and large, trade is not a zero-sum game. It is not something that you win or lose in an agreement. It is a mutually beneficial condition in which everybody benefits. So even approaching this from the framework of who wins and who loses is deleterious to the free trade regime. You're going to foster resentments among those who perceive themselves to have lost, and then they will no longer see the benefits of a free trade regime. It's the sort of thing, because nations have honor, nations have dignity, nations prize intangible resources like respect in ways that I don't think a lot of people who consider themselves realist fully appreciate. But wars have begun over less.
Oh, yeah. Well, Adiger. We can go through a whole bunch of idiotic
The
reasons to start a
Peloponnesian.
war.
Let's have Victor Davis Hanson on to talk about it.
Yeah, but my point is the free rider effect is also part of classical economists. You know, the tragedy of the commons is everybody wants the free trade to go across oceans that are protected by a superpower. We're the superpower. NATO's supposed to be paying 2%. They never paid 2%. Now they've said 5%. I'll believe it when I see it. Until then, we have
we
tariffs.
can't even meet that obligation, Hugh. We
No, we
spend
can't.
something like 3% of GDP, and we will not be spending 5% of GDP on defense. So we'll be setting
No, we
obligations
won't,
for
but
ourselves that we will not be able to meet. And then the Europeans
But
will say,
that
well, you're not
doesn't
meeting
let
it.
them off the hook. We're still carrying the burden. It is our legacy burden that we accepted and we've carried, and they were supposed to share with us that they didn't. So I think it's an IOU coming due on Europe. Moreover, I didn't hear anyone mention non-trade, non-tariff trade barriers. For example, Europe's got a bunch of pesky regulations about ag products that cannot be brought in with genetically engineered seed. Isn't this resetting? A lot of that's made up, Noah. It's
Yeah,
ridiculous.
it's ridiculous. A lot of it is made up. A lot of it is very deleterious to the developing world, which a lot of these nations bite on these conspiracy theories, block the importation of genetically modified seeds, which are not chemically engineered seeds. They're just seeds that are resistant to certain bacteria or viruses or what have you, and subsequent or have certain nutritional value that is otherwise lacking. And you have countries that have eschewed that, and their citizenry suffers as a result. You could say the same thing about the organic farming craze that collapsed Sri Lanka's economy a couple of years back. These are the sort of things we should discourage. I would hope that we would also discourage, for example, our own distortive market practices, like the entire corn industry. All of Europe has reason to resent America's corn subsidies and the degree to which we divert that into inefficient ethanol fuels. So everybody's got grievances when it comes to the agricultural sector. Those are the
But
sorts of
am
things
I
that are worked
wrong
out
to
over
believe?
generations of trade talks.
Am I wrong to believe that we? I know the GATT 1, GATT 2, GATT 405 is supposed to
Takes
do that.
forever to negotiate a
But
trade deal. Yeah.
but Japan has never let rice in. They never let rice in because we hear again and again and again rice is what we need to make here in Japan. I'm going to talk with Noah during the break about trade. We're going to come back and talk about Gaza. Don't go anywhere, America. I'm Hugh Hewitt. Part two with Noah Rothman of the trade discussion. No, I always listen to the editors. I always find it fascinating. I always love that Charles makes the point that no one seems to hear. The tariff power is explicitly delegated to Congress. They are not doing this. This is Donald Trump under the national security exemption. Do you folks believe that the federal courts are going to strike him down in doing this?
I am not an expert in this realm, but I'm not confident of that because Charlie's correct that this power has been delegated constitutionally to Congress, but through statute over the course of several generations, Congress has delegated this authority to the president or its executive agencies. The agencies shall determine. So I don't think that the courts will necessarily be able to say, look, you've delegated your authority improperly. I wish they would, but I think that that would be a bridge too far for at least this Supreme Court. I don't think they would be inclined to adjudicate an issue of separation of powers like that. I could be wrong, but it's my impression that that is not going to be forthcoming.
You see, Charles always brings it up, and I always say to myself as I listen, and I'll talk to him the next time he's on. Well, if the European trading partners, who have got very good lawyers, in fact, the same lawyers our people have, they all work for the same mega firm, big law that combines every Anglo common law jurisdiction one way or another. Their offices in every major European country, and they're in the United States. If they thought it was unconstitutional, they would have told Europe to hold out, right? Because it would be struck down. So it's not going to be struck down. So Trump basically has been delegated this power. I'm just being practical. I think he's getting a pretty good deal for America, and I don't think it's going to hurt me, Hugh Hewitt. How's it going to hurt Noah?
Oh, it's going to hurt me because my precious Spanish Riojas and Bordeaux's are going to be more expensive. They may be $2 to $3 more expensive per bottle. Who knows? I'm being facetious, but we are beginning to feel the effects of these tariffs, in part because they don't make a ton of sense from a strategic point of view. We have exempted all our high performing sectors with regards to the European deal and the Chinese deal, all the stuff that really makes money, where the United States is very competitive, high-end goods like planes. That stuff's off the table. What we have effective tariffs on now are is the stuff where we are not competitive, where the United States doesn't produce the sorts of things that we consume: furniture, toys, tools, machine parts, auto parts. Those are the sort of things that we outsourced over the course of a globalized economic revolution that spanned 30 years to countries that have a competitive advantage to that, so that we could focus on the things that make us a lot of money. We have not focused on those things because they don't make us a lot of money, because there's not a huge labor force in excess that is ready to go into these shops and start assembling toys. We just don't do that anymore.
There is a middle
Economies
ground
that
there.
are
I don't want to talk
developing
about
do that.
toys,
So now
but
we've made all these things
pharmaceuticals.
more expensive, and we have no way to attract those industries. The whole point of tariffs as a tool of statecraft is to make it more expensive for you to import foreign goods to create and develop these industries domestically. We don't want a domestic toy industry. We don't want a domestic little screw
Well, I've
industry
got some
screwing in
friends
the
at
iPhone
Hasbro in
screws.
Rhode Island that would disagree with you, but we're coming back on the network. Stand by, Noah. I guess we're going to have to talk about tariffs one more time. Welcome back, America. I'm Hugh Hewitt. Noah Rothman is stuck around with me. Noah, you and I agree on almost everything when it comes to trade and tariff, but I do point out there's a middle ground here where maybe Trump is smarter than we are when it comes to a lot of this stuff. Last week, AstraZeneca announced a $50 billion investment in manufacturing facilities for pharmaceutical production in the United States, primarily in Virginia, but other states. Glenn Youngkin was doing some results, so was Donald Trump. AstraZeneca's CEO came over to announce it. Is that not what tariffs are supposed to do?
Well, tariffs, we wouldn't be able to do that. Listen, the pharmaceutical industry wouldn't be able to say, in Europe, wouldn't be able to say, these pharma tariffs aren't so bad because most of us have a presence in the United States, so we can get around them, right? They wouldn't be able to say that unless they already had a presence in the United States. So no, tariffs are not incentivizing the development of a European pharmaceutical presence in the US. It was here already. It may create and incentivize the expansion of those programs, but it's not as though they didn't exist. What we're doing
That's
with
parsing
tariffs,
very fine, Noah. If
that's
they've
not
added
parsing fine. Phew, I
5,000
reject
jobs.
it. I reject it. I reject it. They had responded to economic incentives initially that were there in the first place. We didn't need tariffs to create that incentives. What tariffs do is arrest the organic development of the domestic and international economy and substitute someone else's vision in Washington for what the economy should look like. We call that industrial policy. You might as well call it central planning. It is the same thing, and it doesn't work. It creates inefficiencies and bottlenecks, and it reduces economic growth. That's what tariffs do.
That's a
You might have a
classical
reason to
statement
do it,
of
but
free
there's a
market.
lot of downsides.
I believe that, but I also believe it's very much more complicated than that, and that we ought to give at least some space to the idea that maybe it will work. Now, I got to ask you about the most important thing on today's agenda. There is a story in the Times of Israel. Experts say Gaza at worst case scenario, famine about to cause widespread death. Calling for urgent action now. Integrated Food Security Phase Classification. IFSPC says situation in the Strip is unlike anything we have seen in this century, comparing it to Biafra, etc. Have you ever heard of the Integrated Food Security Phase Classification? And B, do you believe it?
I sure have, Hugh. The IPC in March of 2024 alleged that famine was imminent in Gaza. It turns out that it was not, and the outlet later confessed the conditions that it anticipated developing would not develop. Exactly a year later, the IPC came out again and said that there was famine imminent in this country. Indeed, 14,000 babies would die in the next 48 hours. You can go check this claim. It was the IPC and they retailed it. And the BBC published it unreservedly. Only later did they ask for a little bit of explanation, and it turns out that it wasn't babies, it wasn't 48 hours, it wasn't death. It was all of these things were sort of possible, but exaggerated, and would take place over the course of 12 months along a straight line trajectory if conditions never changed. And they did, of course, change. Now we have the IPC saying that a famine is inevitable. And fortunately for the IPC, there's a little bit more verifiable evidence on the ground that shortages are becoming a source of real hardship for Gazans and malnutrition on the ground in Gaza. Israel's getting a lot of heat for this, but I'm quite sure that the degree of it has been exaggerated, because it is always exaggerated. That is not to say there is no hardship or harm on the ground in Gaza. Gazans are suffering dearly, and indeed there's not nearly enough aid on the ground for them to get at it. But why? The UN said it was not moving these trucks in order to supplement the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, which has distributed a US-based Israel charity, which has distributed 100 million meals over the course of 2 months to this 2 million population. Nevertheless, it's not enough. Why was the UN trucks not moving? They're sitting on 900 tons of aid. Why? The IDF says that the United Nations did not believe that security corridors the IDF had cleared were secure, so it stopped transit. In other words, the UN agency was attempting, among other things, but this particular reason rankled me, was attempting to say that Israel's security priorities were not its own, and until those changed, the aid would not move, securing for itself, holding this aid hostage to extort Israel into changing its security priorities for the benefit of the United Nations functionaries. This is a rogue element. The United Nations is on Hamas's side. It is deeply invested in the preservation of this terrorist group, and the terrorist group is deeply invested in the maintenance and preservation of the UN authority that distributes aid, and indeed allows Hamas to pilfer it and extort the public by selling it back to them. This has been a long-running story, and we're now it's getting to the point at which it's almost accepted at face value that Israel is engineering a massive famine for strategic and tactical purposes in Gaza. It's an unquestioned shibboleth among a particular set
I agree with everything you said.
Commentators.
I also think that Great Britain joined France today in declaring they're going to recognize a Palestinian state. Israel is losing in the international information space. There's no way to get around it.
And this is a result of it is. And I sympathize with Netanyahu's tactic here. I believe that he thinks, and in Jerusalem believes, that Hamas holds onto its power because it extorts the public with this aid, and they wanted to throttle that. I understand it, but it has backfired. It has resulted in a PR
I don't know if it's backfired. I don't know that there's an alternative. We'll continue to talk about it. Thank you for the addendum to our tariff talk. Noah Rothman, National Review. Go listen to the editors for a full discussion of tariffs in today's edition of The Editor. Stay tuned.